Welcome to the first podcast from Last Minute Productions entitled One Big Boat. We're all in this together. Each episode will feature a nonprofit whose work is making a true difference in people's lives. Today, we welcome Shahir Mustafa, President and CEO of Hopewell.
Hello, I'm Gary Gillis. I'm one of the partners here at Last Minute Productions, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of One Big Boat. It's our podcast series, and I'm very pleased to have with us today Shahir Mustafa, who's President and CEO of Hopewell, and you guys are doing some very innovative work in the foster care space. So, Shahir, let's first get a little bit of background on Hopewell, if you don't mind.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me. Appreciate it. So Hopewell is the largest nonprofit provider of comprehensive foster care in Massachusetts. So we work primarily in the child welfare and foster care space. So we run programs that are preventative in nature, and then we work with kids all the way through the foster care journey until they age out of foster care. We have programs to support them at that point, and then we also do some work with adults with intellectual disabilities.
So you talk about preventive work as well. And I imagine that, the goal is to keep kids in the home if they can be kept in the home. So what is that preventive work like?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, the best way to address the experience of kids in foster care is to, avoid that from ever happening in the first place. Kids belong in their families when it's safe to do so. So we have a team that we will deploy into a family's home once they come into contact with the child welfare system. So usually that's triggered by what's called a 51A, which is in Massachusetts. That's the mandated report for abuse or neglect. If that is a substantiated claim, then a team like ours can be deployed by the department to go into the home, work with them to resolve whatever the concerns are that brought them to the attention of the department, with the idea of keeping the kids in the home. That support can also be used in the situation, which is sometimes inevitable, where kids do come into foster care. Our team can go in and work with the family to support reunification. So again, prevent kids from coming into care in the first place, but if they do come into care, the goal is always to get them back to the family as quickly and safely as possible.
Now, how often does it happen that, it's a first-time experience where a call comes in and the authorities, whoever that might be, whether it's police or, maybe the call goes to DCF first, where the first experience is the kids are immediately taken out on that? Or, is there some kind of, you talk about abuse or neglect, and is that substantiated? So how does that process work?
Yeah, so just to give a kind of it's a great question, to give us a sense of scale and scope of what we're talking about. So the vast majority of families that come into contact with the Department of Children and Families, which is our child welfare institution here in Massachusetts, the vast majority do not enter foster care. So about 85% roughly will stay in their home. So only about 15% will actually come into foster care at any given point. Now, to what you're talking about would be like considered an emergency removal. And emergency removals are a subset of that 15%. And I don't have that data off the top of my head, but my experience tells me it would maybe be about half of that number. So I would say on whole, it's a relatively low percentage that it's so extreme that kids need to immediately be removed because it's an imminent danger.
And, when I hear the words abuse and neglect, abuse, I think, fairly self-explanatory, but neglect, sometimes that's a little, a little
squishy.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, just to kind of level set a little bit. So of all the cases that come to the department's attention, about 80%, give or take, are for neglect. So physical abuse, sexual abuse are clearly the minority of cases, anywhere from 15 to 20% roughly. The rest fall into that broad bucket of neglect. And what we find is that there is a very close correlation between poverty and neglect, right? So witnessing domestic violence would be considered neglect in most cases. Not meeting medical milestones or not getting to medical appointments would be neglect. Missing school would fall into the category of neglect, and hygiene, basic needs not being met would fall into the category of neglect.
So even, I mean, if somebody is struggling financially, maybe they're insecure in their housing, those are sometimes things that are out of their control, but they would fall into perhaps that neglect category?
That can unfortunately happen. I mean, I do think the department is not interested in trying to, bring people in unnecessarily. That said, I think sometimes, those lines can get blurred, unfortunately. And the way our system is designed and the way our system is set up is we don't kind of incentivize prevention, unfortunately. And that's not just true in child welfare. That's true across the board, right? Like we have a tendency to wait, and then when things get really bad, then we intervene, right? We do that in criminal justice. We do that in all sorts of different systems. And child welfare is no different than that. And I think, unfortunately, we do find families that come onto the department's radar where if we had upstream supports that could address some of those poverty issues, I suspect we could avoid what I think is some unnecessary involvement in child welfare.
I know that you yourself worked within DCF in foster care placement, Shahir. And, what were some of the things that you recognize as opportunities to prevent it from getting to this point that you think we, I guess as a society and certainly here in the state, are not doing that might have an impact? Positive.
Yeah, no. So I was at the department for about 6 years. I was the director of areas over 2 area offices, which covered child welfare response across about 31 cities and towns. And that was a very, very valuable experience because I got to see firsthand kind of the challenges that the department faces and the limitations, quite frankly, of that system in terms of what it's capable of. I think the best way I would answer that is that we lack a systemic response that's outside of child welfare. I think what ends up happening is we point it towards child welfare, and child welfare is then in a moment having to respond with very little information in a moment of crisis, right? And has to make kind of some snap decisions. Where if we had a system in place that could provide families the support they need without it getting to that point, I think that is what is missing. And I think that's where we need better communication between, our housing system, our, social welfare safety net supports, all of these other supports that would benefit families to help them be stable on their feet so that they can avoid coming into contact with it in the first place. To me, that's the gap that I feel like is missing.
Yeah. What kind of numbers are we talking about anyway, in terms of the number of kids that do come in contact with the foster care system?
Yeah, so it's about 8,000 roughly a year will be in foster care. And then there's about 40,000, in child welfare, just in general.
Yeah. And, you, if I remember correctly, have about 500 kids that you...
So on a daily basis, so over the course of a year, we serve about 2,000 kids and families. Yeah.
And what is it that you think you are able to do outside of, there are certain parameters that DCF lays down, sort of minimum requirements, obviously, when a child gets placed into a foster home. What is it that Hopewell is able to do to address some of the needs that this particular population of kids, will run into?
Yeah. So I think it's important to understand there's essentially 2 different types of foster care. So the department themselves actually recruit, license, and train their own foster parents, and then they can contract out to agencies like ours to do the same thing. The difference is our service and support is typically for kids who have higher end behavioral challenges. Maybe they've experienced more trauma, and their needs are a little bit more robust. So as a result of that, our foster parents receive more training. We have a much more high touch model. So we see kids and our foster parents 5 times a month. They get a weekly visit from their social worker plus a monthly visit from the family resource worker, compared to the department, which would be a once a month visit from the family resource worker and a once a month visit from the social worker. In addition to that, our foster parents are compensated at a higher rate. I mean, it's nothing, you're not going to get rich by doing this, let me tell you, but so there's that component as well. So And then, that's just on the foster care side. But outside of that, we have launched 2 programs, one in particular that both I'm excited about, but one in particular I'm very excited about, which is addressing some of the downstream effects of being in foster care, particularly the educational opportunity gap. So I'm sure we'll get to that at some point. But we are in a position, because we're a private nonprofit, to be able to be a little bit more nimble than an entire state system. So we can innovate and design and launch some new programs, which I'm really excited about, that I believe could really reshape how we think about foster care and the impact of that system on kids.
So what are those 2 programs that you're talking about?
Yeah, so the 2 that I'm thinking about, the first is our My First Place program. So that is for youth who are aging out of foster care. And then the second is our RISE program, which is a literacy model for grades K through 3. I think before I get to what those programs are, though, it might be helpful to just set some context for what happens to kids as they move through the foster care system. So kids experiencing foster care are our nation's most marginalized group of young people. And the data bears this out. There is no subset of young people in our country that have more poor outcomes than kids experiencing foster care. So let me just give you some data. So nearly half will experience homelessness by the time they exit 1 year post exiting foster care. Only 3 will receive a post-secondary degree. And 75% of males who have any contact with child welfare, they don't even have to, be in foster care per se, just to touch the child welfare system. 3 out of 4 will be arrested, incarcerated, on probation or parole by the time they're 26 years old. So when you think about, there's a clear foster care to prison pipeline for young men. So this is what we're talking about. It's a stain on our social conscience. It's completely unacceptable. So just providing a safe place for kids to be is clearly not enough. We need to do more to prevent kids from coming into care, and then once they're in care, doing something, in my opinion, to help close that academic opportunity gap.
Coming up.
For the kids who are aging out, we feel we have a responsibility. We maybe couldn't have gotten to them further upstream, but we have to do something to support them now.
What is Hopewell doing for those that have aged out of foster care?
For the kids who are aging out, we feel we have a responsibility. We maybe couldn't have gotten to them further upstream, but we have to do something to support them now. So we address that homelessness issue because we take housing off the table. We provide safe, stable, supportive housing in the communities where they're from. They don't have to pay rent. Their only obligation is they need to go to school or be working so that they can work towards sustainable adulthood. And then the RISE program is focused on that, specifically on that academic opportunity gap. So what we know is that if kids are not able to be proficient in reading by 3rd grade, their long-term, life outcomes diminish greatly. And kids in foster care are the most, have the poorest outcomes when compared to their non-foster peers. So we have designed the first model in the country to address this issue so that we can get kids to the point where they are proficient in reading by the end of 3rd grade. So we do high impact tutoring and educational support for kids. Right now it's in Boston only. And we are, refining that model as we go. And, there's some bumps in the road, but it's really, it's this is the type of innovation that I was talking to you about before that, we are capable of doing so that we can learn from that. And then hopefully this can be something that becomes an entitlement support for all kids experiencing foster care.
Because right now, this is not coming out of the contract money from DCF. I mean, this is above and beyond. So these are funded by an outside source.
Yes and no. So the My First Place program, when we first launched that, we seeded it with our own resources, and we had the generous support of philanthropy. We were able to secure a contract which funds a portion of it, but it's an expensive model. I mean, when you're housing kids, it's not cheap. So we have to kind of braid our funding using philanthropy, our own cash reserves, and the contract. The RISE program is almost exclusively funded through philanthropy because we're at a stage now where we're essentially trying to prove concept. And we've had some very, very generous and I would say donors with vision who are willing to, take some risks on what may or may not work in supporting our development of this model. So that one is, almost exclusively through philanthropy.
Now, kids who experience foster care, their graduation rate, even from high school, is pretty poor, is my understanding, yes. Right? Mm-hmm. And so, how long, what's the average stay, I guess, if, a RISE program is great, and it is addressing that gap, that early gap, does a lack of academic support the rest of their life experiencing foster care, how does that impact kids?
Yeah, so what we know is there's a clear compounding effect. So what we know is the longer you're in foster care, the more likely your outcomes will be poor. So, not in the experience of being in foster care is not universal. It's not the same, right? So if you come into foster care, but you're placed with a relative and you live there for a year and then you return back to your family, that's one scenario. Another scenario is you come into foster care, you're not placed with a relative, you bounce to 6 different placements in 2 years, and then you've changed schools multiple times, right? So you can see how, now that's all foster care, but they're completely different experiences. So what we know is the more placements you have, the worse you are. When you're not placed with a relative, tends to be the worse your experience is, and just the overall length of time you spend in care has a direct correlation to poor academic outcomes and all other life outcomes. So
when you're talking about the kids aging out and being able to, give them My First Place, they have to opt in, or how do you identify which kids you might, enroll in this, so to speak, because you can't do it for everyone. Mm-hmm.
So yes. So the way our system here in Massachusetts works is that on a young person's 18th birthday, they have the opportunity to opt in for voluntary services with the department, but they have to opt into it. Other states have a different type of trigger. It's an automatic enrollment, and then the young person would have to opt out. That's actually what I think is a better system. We don't yet have that here in Massachusetts, but something that we can work towards. So they can opt in, and then when they opt in, there are certain services that do become available to them. One of the supports that theoretically could be available to them is a placement service like ours, our My First Place program. What I will say is that is not something that is liberally or easily given out to kids when they turn 18. Right. I think, for many reasons, that's just not the primary focus of the department. Their focus tends to be more on children, kids under the age of 18. And I remember this when I was at the department, and just if you can spare me this one departure, but it would not be uncommon to walk into the office and have 3 kids sitting on the couch whose mom overdosed on heroin, no place to go, and where everybody in the office is scrambling to figure out where are we going to put these 3 kids tonight. And then on the other side of the lobby is a 18-year-old kid who just got kicked out of his 3rd group home for smoking weed, and that kid also needs a place to go. Now, what inevitably happens is the 3 kids are the ones that everybody focuses on. And I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do. But that 18-year-old, he was those kids, earlier. And our system failed him. And that kid needs a place too. But they don't get the same attention. And that to me is what I see when we think about kids aging out. So while technically some of these supports are available to them, the actual access and uptake of those services, we don't see in the same way. The simple answer to your question is we can support them through our contract. So if they've volunteered into DCF services, DCF says we will fund this service, the young person is interested in that service, we can take them. But because of the support of philanthropy, quite honestly, we are able to take some kids outside of that contract. So we have kids who've just found us on a website. They've been referred to us by organizations like Bridge Over Troubled Waters or More Than Words or some of these other places, and they will refer to us. And then because we can support them through philanthropy, we can place them without the contract, which to me is that flexibility is essential.
What other type of services are there? Wraparound services that you provide in the My First Place? I'm thinking of, budgeting. When I was 18 years old, I could have used something like that, right? Or, just even some career advice. Yes, I got career advice, but okay, what else are you able to provide?
Yeah, so the model is, as I mentioned, we provide the housing, but it's really the wraparound support that I think differentiates things. So we have what's called a youth advocate. So these are typically like a trained social worker, like a clinical social worker. So they're working with the young person on adapting to life independently and, maybe supporting their behavioral health and case management supports, kind of just a general person who can kind of be there as a primary point of contact and support as they navigate this journey. We also have what's called an education and employment specialist. And while that person is trained in some of the same ways and maybe comes from a trauma-informed place, it's a little bit more like good cop, bad cop. They're like, you know what? We understand and appreciate all the trauma you've experienced, but quite frankly, the world doesn't care. Your boss doesn't care if you don't show up on time. If your resume is a mess, you're not going to get a job. If you can't, have good, reliable tech to log into your virtual classes and you're not participating, that's going to be a problem. So they're the ones who are really working on kind of those hard skills. And I think it's the combination of the two that actually is essential, because kids need structure and discipline. We can't just forgive you because you had a hard life. That's just setting them up for failure. But at the same time, we have to appreciate where they are and what they've been through. So it's both of those things together. And then we have a housing specialist who works with our landlords, make sure the properties are, up to speed, works with the young people around their tenancy skills. Because again, when you're living on your own, there's a lot to navigate there. So it's the constellation of those three people in every young person's life who is a part of our My First Place program, with the safe, stable housing. It's all of that together that really makes it unique and special.
We've talked so far mostly about kids who experience foster care, but foster parents obviously play a huge role in this system. And I know just anecdotally, things that I've heard, and tell me if I'm wrong, Shahir, because I'm wrong plenty of times, but, if a child experiences even one adult who cares and shows some kind of compassion, shows that they really have an interest in what this child might achieve, that can change the outcome considerably. Now, when you're looking for foster parents to recruit, not everybody is going to be Mary Poppins or that. So, how challenging is it to find foster parents, and what kind of a pool do you end up drawing from?
Yeah, so it's a challenge. And what we have seen, and this is national, not just locally, is a declining willingness of people to open their home and become foster parents. So we see an aging demographic of people that have been doing this. I think the average age of our foster parents is somewhere in like the mid-50s. And that age kind of continues to climb. And for every foster parent that decides that, they're going to retire, they're going to step away from this, we're not backfilling them at the same rate. Mm-hmm. So that's a challenge, right? So we're upside down there. Fostering is hard. It's, this is my entire career. I've dedicated my life to this. And my family, we recently became foster parents after, something we had always thought we wanted to do. And we finally made the decision to do it. And what I can tell you is, I thought I knew a lot about it, right? This is what I do. I'm kind of like, I kind of know what I'm talking about. But until you actually do it, it's, you just can't really fully appreciate, what it takes, how challenging it is, and quite frankly, how incredibly rewarding it is. So, I think it's one of the best decisions that we've ever made, and it's something that I hope to continue to do for a long time. But it's not for everybody. But what it can bring to your family is almost indescribable in terms of a value, if people are willing to do it.
What do you think some of the misconceptions are about the kids who end up getting placed into a foster home? That they're all troubled kids, that they're going to be behavioral problems, that, oh, do I have to, lock away my possessions? Or, I mean, these are things that I've, heard when discussing foster care.
I mean, you just named it right there. I mean, last year, May is Foster Care Awareness Month. Last May, we commissioned a study to kind of just get a pulse check on people's perceptions around foster care. And what we found is exactly what you said, that there's a very clear misperception that the reason kids come into foster care is because they have behavior problems. And that's just patently false. It's just not accurate. The reason kids come into foster care is because their parents are not able to keep them safe. And so, through no fault of their own, they've come into into the situation that they're in. So that to me is the first misconception. Now, can they have behavioral problems? Of course they can. I mean, if you look at any child who's either been underparented or experienced, trauma, we know the impact that can have on the development of a young child and the manifestation in their behavior. So those things can, be a part of the equation. But I think it's important to understand the origin of that and the constellation of how that comes to be. Right? It's not because the kids are bad kids. It's because they've experienced some really, really hard things. And I'm not deeply experienced as a foster parent, but in my experience so far with the placements that we've had, when you can kind of place the child's behavior in the context of what they've experienced, and hold a balanced perspective and work with them and support them through that, like, kids are very resilient. They are capable of making changes. I'm 46. I'm not as capable of making changes, but kids are a different ballgame altogether.
So, maybe somebody who's watching this, it has sparked something in their mind, or, thinking about the outreach that you do. If you had the opportunity to speak with somebody who, maybe there's a little tickle there, they might say, that's something I might consider. What would you say to them about taking the next steps towards becoming a foster parent?
Yeah, I would encourage them to have a conversation. I mean, I think everybody's situation, potential reservations, hopes, expectations is going to be unique to their situation. And I think it's worth exploring it with somebody or an organization who has experience in this and can be honest with you about what to potentially expect. We're not in the business of selling people to become foster parents, and that's just a setup for everybody involved. I mean, we need to be transparent and sober about what it entails. And so I would encourage you to talk to an organization like ours, reach out to the department. There are other private providers like us. I would reach out and have some of those conversations and explore the potential reality of what it could be for you and your family. It's not a decision that should be made lightly. That said, it's one that can be incredibly rewarding, and then just the impact that it can have on literally changing the trajectory and outcomes of a child's life. I mean, it's that profound. And if you are even considering that, what's the harm in having a conversation to explore that further? You're not necessarily committing to anything.
I always ask at the end, is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you think is important to share?
Nothing comes to mind. Yeah. No, thank you.
No. Shahir Mustafa, CEO and President of Hopewell, thanks very much for coming and sharing your time and information. And we hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we hope you join us next time on One Big Boat. Thanks.
One Big Boat is a production of Last Minute Productions, Incorporated. Executive producer, Jay Dobeck. This episode was produced by Gary Gillis. The sound engineer was Scott Wyman. Production support was provided by Jim Johnston, and Joanne Pilata was the production coordinator.